Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sayuri Guthrie Shimizu. I teach American history at Rice University in Houston, the great republic, former Republic of Texas. I would like to start out. Oh, thank you. Oh. Yeah, I just keep forgetting that I'm much shorter than most of the gentlemen here. So I would like to begin by thanking Professor Marcus Holmes and Hiroshi Kitamura for inviting me to this wonderful event. And also, I would like to thank them for all the hard work that went into organizing this event. So this is, as Professor Holmes introduced, I think I was invited here in my capacity as the author of this book, Transpacific Field of Dreams. And as you can tell, it's a totally corny title. When my editor at the University of North Carolina Press and I were exchanging ideas about what title to pick, and I said, what about Transpacific Field of Dreams? Because I was thinking of a movie contract, maybe. There hasn't been any offer made yet, so if you are interested in turning into a movie, then I'm available. So, so anyway, but seriously, it really, this title, the Transpacific Field of Dreams, really captures the essence of U.S.-Japanese exchange. And as I argued in this book, baseball was and still is a great vehicle for projecting many things that crisscross the Pacific between the late 19th century and now. Why the late 19th century? Because that's when baseball came to Japan in 1872, to be more exact. And now, well, this is a fast forward to now when the Hanshin Tigers are poised to grab Japan's professional baseball championship this year. So go Tigers! So the baseball is really allowed me as a historian to do a number of things. So baseball is a perfect magnifying glass lens through which we can see the evolution of the relationship between the United States and Japan. And this historical space created by baseball has been loaded with hopes, aspirations, dreams of people who cross the Pacific for a variety of reasons. And also it's a good way to foreground the technologies, information, knowledge that made these Pacific crossings possible. And most importantly, the Trans-Pacific Field of Dreams and using baseball as a subject of historical study, it's a good way to highlight and honor the people who played, coached, watched, and otherwise participated in this beloved sport, a game that is baseball. So what I'd like to do for the next 15 minutes or so, the time assigned to me, is to give you a quick run-through of baseball's central place in U.S.-Japanese relations by talking about the first 80 years of baseball exchange between the United States and Japan. A lot of my colleagues and friends in the United States, they just assume that baseball came to Japan during the post-World War II U.S. occupation period. But the history of baseball in Japan goes much farther back. So the name of the game here is to set up a historical context for people who are not familiar with this story yet. Then I will hand over the baton or the bat to my fellow panelists who will be talking about contemporary matters regarding baseball. So I'm sorry that my talk is already full of cheesy metaphors and cliches, but that's what historians are good at. So, it all started in 1872, and as one of the preceding speakers, maybe Professor Holmes already introduced to you, the young man who introduced baseball to Japan is this guy by the name of Horace Wilson. He was a 28-year-old school teacher from Gorham, Maine. And as you can tell from this Gora, Maine is not really the hub of international globalization, even in those days too. And why did he end up in Japan? And why he ended up introducing the game of baseball to Japanese youth? Because he was out of job after the Civil War. He was a Civil War veteran. And there was a mutual association, kind of a fraternal network among Civil War Union soldiers who would help each other in introducing job and then maybe taking care of the widows. That kind of fraternal network was in place among Union veterans. And Horace Wilson got a job through this network of Civil War veterans. And he got a job to teach math and also English at the institutional predecessor of Tokyo University. And in this time period, in 1872, that's only a few years after the Meiji Restoration. That's when the government of Shogun was overthrown, and then the political rule reverted back to the imperial family. That's called the Meiji Restoration. And so right after the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese government made a very, very conscious effort to recruit specialists, teachers, engineers from overseas to introduce a technology, knowledge, Western knowledge to Japan as part of the government-driven modernization program. And Horace Wilson was one of these young people who got hired by the Japanese government in the 1820s, and there were many other Civil War veterans like Horace Wilson who fanned out to different parts of Japan and then taught Japanese boys how to play baseball. So this is how it all got started. And the baseball actually began in Japan as a student sport. It's remained so, student sport for a long time. It did not have a professional baseball until 1930s. But until the mid-1930s, college and high school sports were what the baseball was about in Japan. And there were active exchange of college teams in the early few decades of the 20th century. So this is the portrait of the first Japanese collegiate team, Waseda University team, that toured West Coast and U.S. West Coast cities and play against local amateur teams and also Japanese American teams. And Waseda University set up a very, very robust and long-lasting baseball exchange regimen with the University of Chicago, which at the time in the early 20th century had just been established as a newly minted private university, tried to make it, and then University of Chicago's legendary football head coach, Alonzo Amos Staggs, he decided that having every 5 years, the regular baseball exchange with an exotic Oriental college like Waseda University might be good publicity for the University of Chicago. So that's how it got started. And then Waseda and University of Chicago just exchanged the delegation teams every 5 years. And that continued until the 1830s. And that's one reason why that the Waseda University school color is maroon. They got it from the University of Chicago's maroon. So there was a really interesting kind of aside there too. So this is Japan's, the baseball remained students' sports for a long time, but also there was other avenue of amateur baseball exchange. Japan's overseas migration started in the 1880s after the Meiji Restorations, and Japan's migration to Hawaii and the United States mainland began in 1880s. And then that really picked up in the 1890s, in the first decade of the 20th century. So a lot of Japanese, second-generation Japanese Americans playing baseball against Japanese amateur players was sort of like a cultural ritual at a homecoming tour of sort. And this is how these amateur baseball players travel, Japanese American players travel far and wide to the Japanese mainland. And in those days, the Japanese was still an empire, the colonial empire. So those Japanese-American teams from Hawaii and from the American mainland not only toured around Japan, but also the Japanese colonial possessions in Korea and Taiwan as well. So in the early 20th century, there was a really big technological breakthrough. That is, the Transpacific steamship service became so much more regular, reliable, and cheap. That was frequent and cheap. And this is how that the amateur baseball exchange started in earnest in the early decades of the 20th century. And then also there was the massive circulation of printed materials, magazines and newspapers in Japan at the time. And in this printing universe, that athletic exploits of Japanese baseball players and also American baseball players were publicized far and wide as well, and turning the baseball into a really, really popular national pastime in the 1920s and 1930s. And American professional teams began to also tour Japan in the early decades of the 20th century. First, it was just the AAA Pacific Coast League teams, but in 1823, a team of the Negro League team also toured Japan, even that was before the Major League Baseball. And as Mr. Small already talked about, in 1933 and 1934, Major League Baseball teams that included Babe Ruth toured Japan. And then this is the pictures from that time, and you can see what kind of hero's welcome that he received from the Japanese adoring fans. And that was also a huge media event as well. And I find this really remarkable. That's 1934, and then Japanese people just adore baseball, and it was a really big media event. And that was like only a few years after the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and the diplomatic relations between the Japan and the United States was quickly souring. So there was this one layer of diplomatic relations that was going downhill, but there was a really interesting undertow of affinity shared through the baseball between the Japanese people and the American people as well. And so fast forward to World War II. So the U.S.-Japanese baseball exchange came to a screeching halt after Pearl Harbor, of course, and various Major League Baseball players served in World War II. Most of them had a pretty cushy position, if I may put it that way, playing baseball exhibition games and then selling war bonds by playing baseball game, like Joe DiMaggio, who was in Hawaii playing baseball the whole time. But there was also somebody like Ted Williams, the Boston Red Sox. He actually did serve in a combat duties as well. So there was this very interesting experience, varied experience of major baseball players during World War II. But for Japanese professional baseball players during World War II, it was a uniformly really grim experience. I give you one example. There's this one pitcher, the Tokyo Giants pitcher by the name of Eiji Samamura. He made a name for himself during the Babe Ruth Japan's trip in 1934, that he struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and someone else, like in the 3 successions. And he was almost recruited by the Pittsburgh Pirates along the way. Anyway, but this guy, Eiji Sawamura, he was drafted 3 times during World War II, and then during the last 3rd tour of duty, then he was on the sunken Japanese oiler, and then he died off the coast of Taiwan. But so this was a World War II, but it's really, I would like to point out that it was rather remarkable that the Japanese baseball, professional baseball, continued its season until 1944. That was the year before the end of World War II, and only the 1945 season was canceled altogether. And what is even more remarkable is when the war ended and when the American occupation forces came ashore, that baseball came back to Japan, and U.S.-Japanese baseball resumed quickly. It was in November 1945, which was only 3 months after Japan surrendered. And it was only 2 months after the occupation forces came. So you can imagine, and you can tell from this fact that how embedded baseball was in Japanese life, as well as the fabric of U.S.-Japanese relations too. And the baseball received very preferential treatment compared to other team sports. And there were many former Major League Baseball players or just former college players amongst the U.S. occupation forces. And these are the people that who also visited Japanese schools to coach war-stricken, dejected Japanese youth how to really regain their love of baseball that way too. And these kinds of baseball playing a major role in the U.S. occupation forces cultural diplomacy was getting a full blessing of the occupation forces commander-in-chief, General Douglas MacArthur as well. So the culmination, I'm sorry, then I forgot to mention. So during World War II, the Japanese Americans were interned in various internment camps in the mountain states, and basically they were relocated away from the West Coast. But these Japanese Americans, what did they do? One of the first things they did, when even in the despair of the Japanese internment camp, they organized a baseball league. And then there was interesting records of different the top team of different internment camps actually playing together, and that was the only time they were allowed to travel outside of the barbed wire, and then also to visit other internment camps as well. So this is the wartime, and then in the occupation period, it was there, and then it became a really the sports in Japan during the occupation period. And the culmination of that was, the Pacific Coast League of San Francisco Seals, headed and managed by Lefty O'Dole, headed a tour of goodwill tour to Japan in 1949. That was the first professional game baseball, American baseball team touring Japan, occupied Japan. That was in 1949. And Lefty O'Dole was also a member of the 1934 Major League Baseball delegation featuring Babe Ruth. And during this SEALs tour, the Japanese, another really poignant and telling example of how essential baseball was to U.S.-Japanese relations at the level of symbolism is that the games were played still during Japan's occupation period. So under normal circumstances, the Japanese flag would not be allowed to be hoisted, and the Japanese national anthem would not be allowed to play. But during the SEALs tours in 1949 to occupy Japan, the Occupation Forces Authority allowed the hoisting of the Japanese flag and singing of the national anthem before the SEALs games. And the Japanese people, that was really the first time that they were able to see the flag after 1945. And then after this tour, Japan became independent in 1932, and during this time period, 1952 to roughly 1972, there was also a steady stream of American professional baseball inflow into Japan. That was that the Major League Baseball teams sent exhibition teams for the American troops stationed in Korea and also Vietnam and Philippines during the height of the Cold War. And these MLB exhibition, off-season exhibition tours almost invariably made their stops in Japan, and then also the Japanese people were able to get the direct taste of the top of Major League Baseball tour during the off season. So, and then I would like to go back to the, how do I go back? Oh, this one is to go back, okay. I would like to go back to this first one, the Transpacific Field of Dreams, as I close. So this is the picture of Joe DiMaggio, and also the gentleman on the left is Shigeru Mizuhara. He was also a former Japanese professional baseball player, and he served during World War II, and he was actually interned in the Soviet Union's labor camp for a long time, and he finally came back in 1951. And this is the picture was really symbolic. This is the lefty Orioles basically drawing together DiMaggio and Mizuhara. They were both veterans of World War II, so they used to be fighters on the opposite sides, and now they are shaking hands on the diamond. And do you know what this date was? September 18th, 1951. That's when the Japanese peace treaty was signed. So baseball was mobilized of that kind of very powerful symbolic purpose as well. So this is what I can tell you by way of setting up a historical context as a historian for why baseball came to Japan, became so important and such a big fabric of U.S.-Japanese relations. So with that, I am going to hand over the bat over to my fellow panelists, and let me do a cheesy metaphor, whatever, a cliche, one last time before I go. As they say, an old historian never dies, she just fades away.